Well, hello there. Thanks for joining me. I am Dr. Jen, and I am so pleased you joined me for today's show, My Life as a Landlord. Fantastic that you're here, especially in our series all about tenant screening, right? This is the number one question I get asked. The number one comment is about screening tenants. Everybody seems to be the most concerned, the most scared about screening tenants. Trust but verify. So here we go. So today is the series episode number 4 of 6 in this series. We're talking about the absolute best crystal ball a landlord has, rental history. And there's a couple other points along the way, but that's a good one. Now think about it this way. Credit tells you that if they can pay, background checks that if they're a safety risk or if they'll behave. But rental history, that tells you how they'll actually treat a property because a leopard doesn't change its spots. It's the most direct evidence that you have of how they will behave in the unit is past landlords, right? Today we're going to talk about how to verify that history, how to interpret the dreaded eviction record should you find one, and what to do when the applicant's story just doesn't add up, right? What do you do when you catch them in a lie? So when we verify rental history, we aren't just looking for a yeah, they were fined from a previous landlord. In fact, I classify landlord references in two ways. One is what I call mechanical. That's where they say yes, no. Yes, no. This is it. They're giving the reference. They're basically checking the box. Or mechanical. I think I also call it whitewashing, right? They're checking the box. But there's the other kind of reference, which is the one you're looking for, is where all you have to do is say a person's name. You don't have to ask any questions. They just go. That's what you want. And it's usually in a good way. If it's in a bad way, they probably aren't going to give you the reference. They're probably not going to give that landlord as a reference, right? But that's the two ways that I see references is you don't want just, yeah, they were fine, yes, no, from a previous landlord. You want the last 5 to 7 years of addresses. You want rent amounts, landlord contact info. And we're looking for three specific things: payment patterns, lease compliance, and then property condition upon move out, right? So the massive pro tip, don't just call the current landlord because there's oftentimes, I know there's bad humans on the planet. Sometimes those landlords will just straight up lie to get a bad tenant out of their building. The previous landlord before that, 2 landlords ago, has absolutely nothing to lose by telling you the truth, right? They have nothing to lose. So the three things we're going to look at again: payment patterns. Were they consistently late? Were they on time? Was there ever an issue with payment? The second thing is lease compliance. Did they have any unauthorized pets, noise complaints, extra roommates, lots and lots of drama, trouble calls that are unnecessary, things like that. And then property condition upon move out. Did they leave the place trashed? And the biggest question I always ask is, did they get their deposit back? That's the other thing. The other question I ask at the very end is, would you rent to them again? Especially not the previous landlord, 2 landlords ago. Would you rent to them again? If the answer is anything other than a glowing yes, that's some big red flags. So make sure you're checking all of that. But let's look at an example. A landlord in Chicago called a current property manager who gave a glowing review of the applicant, and the landlord, being diligent, then called the previous landlord, 2 landlords ago. From 2 years ago, the previous landlord said they paid on time, but they snuck in 3 pit bulls and destroyed the hardwood floors. The applicant was denied based on property damage history. By contrast, a landlord in Calgary, Alberta, called the previous landlord who said they're amazing, paid early every month, kept the place spotless, and even shoveled the walk for other tenants. That's the kind of reference you want. And notice they talked about all kinds of other stuff. They were more character references than anything. And in tenant screening, that's really what you're looking for, is evidence that these tenants are trustworthy. Are they going to behave? Are they going to do what you ask them to do according to the legal agreement? Yeah. But let's talk about the next bit of, let's talk about the E word, evictions. Seeing an eviction filing on a record is a huge red flag, but as a professional landlord, you need to look for context because sometimes it's not as it appears. Did the case end in a judgment against them or was it dismissed? Was it a one-time crisis during a massive economic downturn like a pandemic and they got laid off? Or is there a pattern of serial evictions every 2 years? You must have a written standard for this. For example, we will deny any application with an eviction resulting in a judgment within the last 5 years. So one other way you can look at, if you're looking at court records, if there has been a writ of possession or anything regarding a writ of anything, that is very likely a eviction on their record. So make sure you're understanding when you see court records or you're seeing a criminal background check of any kind, if you're checking all that, writ of possession is an eviction, right? And that's been awarded. So be careful what you're looking for. But you want to make sure that you are looking at patterns. Did this happen 10 years ago and it was weird? Or is it consistent? Or when you look at rental history, they're only going to give you like it's missing bits of where's the rest of their rental history, right? They lived somewhere. So let's look at a US example about eviction filing. In New York, oh boy, in New York, a landlord saw an eviction filing from 2021. Upon further review, the case was dismissed because the tenant caught up on rent using rental assistance funds, which can happen. The tenant had perfect payment history since then, and the landlord approved them. Now, that's a good thing, right? They are using the resources within their means. They got caught up. Clearly, they were behaving, right? This is part of it going, they were about to be evicted, but they got caught up and they're fine, right? So let's look at a example in Canada. In Ontario, eviction records from the Landlord Tenant Board are much harder to search than in the US as they don't appear on standard credit reports. Landlords there rely heavily on specialized tenant screening services like Single Key or Neighborly and on thorough reference checks to uncover LTB orders for non-payments. You want to be very careful and you want to pay the money. And you also want to make sure that when you're doing these checks, I've said this in previous episodes, but I want to make sure, get a picture, government picture ID, so you have their legal name and their birthday. Because if you do that, that when you hire these folks to do the rental history and the criminal record check and even the credit check, if you're in Canada, if you want to check all these things, make sure you're checking the correct name. That's happened to me before. But what happens if they have actually no rental history at all? Maybe they're 22 and they've lived with family, or maybe they're 50 and they just sold the home that they've lived in and they've owned and lived in for the last 30 years. You cannot just reject them out of hand. You need a process. So if they live with family, you can ask for a written statement from the head of the household, but you have to take that with a grain of salt, right? You have to say, okay, is there a chance that they could be biased? They could be, especially again, if it's a family member that wants them out, they might write a letter saying, yeah, they're great, take them, right? But you also need to lean heavily, if you've got someone with minimal rental history, lean heavily on their employment stability and credit score. And if they were homeowners, ask for mortgage statements and property tax records to prove that they paid their housing costs on time. Because again, you're looking for trends. You're looking to make sure, prove to me that you are going to make your payments on time. A lot of this can be done with credit as well, credit checks, credit score, and history with the report. But you want to make sure that you've got a trend, hopefully in a good way, so that you can help with the rental history of the tenant screening, right? You can also ask for a character reference from the HOA president or a longtime neighbor. I have done that myself, which has been great. I've actually called neighbors or driven by their current residence and just see, if you drive by their current residence and their car is trashed or there's garbage all over the yard, or how you do anything is how you do everything. And that's where I'm always looking at this going, you want to make sure that, the leopard doesn't change their spots. Make sure you are clear on who you're doing business with. Okay. So let's talk about an example that involves Vancouver, BC. A landlord in Vancouver had an applicant who was relocating from a rural town where they had owned a farm for the last 20 years. They had no landlord references because they're coming from a rural area. The landlord asked for the last 12 months of mortgage statements, which showed perfect payments, and a reference from their real